Now, the last time I heard David Oldfield, he was doing a radio program, but I certainly know of his political background. He's a very interesting character, politician turned reality star, staunchly right-wing on most political issues, has a talent for attention-grabbing headlines, or perhaps grabbing attention-getting headlines. I didn't know that he was the former private secretary to Prime Minister Tony Abbott. And he was a co-founder of One Nation, I certainly know that. Former Member of Parliament, a broadcaster, a public figure, an adventurer, an animal lover, a father, and now an author. My goodness me, he's a man for every season under the sun. Hello, David, are you there?
Oh, I am, Jeremy. After that introduction, it sounds like the only thing I haven't been is a soldier.
Well, would that interest you?
Oh, I always had a huge interest in the military. If I'd been born in different times, I would have been. But, thank God I wasn't, because I'm one of the lucky few who hasn't had to go to war, because so many others have before I was born and of course, since.
Well, I'm sort of in the same boat. I think it's a great privilege to be able to be a pacifist. If you find yourself born in a more troubled time, there's nothing you can really do about it.
Well, that's it. I mean, I'm the only male, like in the last 100 years, I'm the only male in my family who is not a combat veteran, because all of the others were, preceded me, including my own brother was a Vietnam veteran, but, he's like 14 or 15 years older than me. So, I was just not born at a time when you would have gone into the military for those purposes. But, had it been the case, I would have been compelled by family history to do so. Fortunately, that didn't happen, so I've not been under fire.
But you're kind of a soldier of fortune in other ways. One of my favourite sayings is, as the twig is bent, so shall grow the tree. What sort of a family did you come from? Because you've done so many different things. You've had such a varied life. You must have chosen that varied life. Or did it choose you?
Well, look, it's so hard to say, isn't it? I mean, I do talk a lot in the book. I do talk a lot in the book about my family, because I have such a great love and a tremendous amount of pride for my parents. Both my parents lived through the Depression. My father, as I say, was a decorated combat veteran of World War II and ultimately shot down and captured by the Japanese towards the end of the war. They were, goodness, my mother had peritonitis, would you believe, in 1932, and was the only child in her ward who survived. These are people who lived through times that we just can't really appreciate. So I came from a family who had been through a great deal, come out the other end, and were extraordinarily wonderful Australians.
Looking at the things that you have done, you have obviously been determined to make a difference, to change things, to make an impression. Where does that come from?
Look, in many respects, I think it does come from what I saw my father do and what I saw my brother do in serving the nation. And I have in the past been known to suggest that this was kind of my war. No one was shooting at me, so I was never in any danger like they were and like so many great Australians truly were. But it was something that I felt I needed to do to make that contribution, and that's how I became engaged in politics, quite by accident to a degree in the beginning. But it was very odd that when my father died and I needed to clean out his garage, I found a whole lot of exercise books from when I was 12 years old, or 11 actually, and one of the particular things that I had put in that as a vocation that I wanted to pursue was being a politician. Funnily enough for you and me, Jeremy, I had also listed radio announcer.
Mm-hmm.
So,
who, as you grew up, who were the people who were forming your life, forming your opinions? Was it your family, or was it outside that?
Look, it was. I think a lot of these things, when you're very young, a lot of these things are formed without you necessarily knowing who's forming it. But yes, certainly my parents. My parents, like I suppose a lot of people's parents, had a huge impact on how I came to various views. I came to quite significant views about groups like the moratorium movement and the communists when I was quite young, because I watched my brother come home from Vietnam in 1969. I was only a school child, very young. I was about 10 at the time, but I watched him come home from Vietnam. He was in the regulars, so he'd been a volunteer to go to Vietnam. I watched him come home, and I watched what he went through with all the BS that Australia went through against people who went to Vietnam for decades afterwards. So at a very early age, I did take a particular bent against communists, against the left generally, and against those people who were so hell-bent on destroying the nature of those who've served.
And it's not only the nature of those who served; it's the very fabric of life as we know it today. Because, funnily enough, the people of the left, going way back into the 30s and 40s, were probably more, we'd probably these days call them moderates, or we'd call them people who walked the middle of the road. They didn't seem to be hell-bent on destroying the culture.
Well, it's the whole fabric of the family and the whole fabric of Western society. I mean, you know as well as I do, as so many of your listeners, if not all of your listeners, would know, of course, that it's now apparently a bad thing to be a modern, Western, civilized person who happens to be white.
Yeah, there's something about trying to get a hold of the world as we know it, and as many people would say, as it should be, and turn it upside down just to find your own place in it.
Yeah. No, look, we're beset at the moment. As you say, the lefties of the old probably would have been moderates today. We are beset largely by people who have an agenda that appears just to be anarchy and the desire to break down everything that is traditional about society and family units.
If you took an old-fashioned Labor guy and you talked to him in the 1940s about LGBTIQ, he'd give you a punch in the eye.
Well, and people forget, of course, that how terrible in nature it was, of course, but people forget that the White Australia policy was introduced by the Labor Party.
And indeed, implemented.
And rescinded by the Liberal Party.
Yeah. Of all of these things that you've done, being close to the Prime Minister, I mean, the very seat of power, that must have been an interesting job. But of all these jobs, putting your own political party together, broadcasting, being an adventurer, all of these other bits and pieces that you've done, what is the thing you've enjoyed most?
Well, funnily enough, it was radio. It was radio, Jeremy. I loved, of all of the things I've done, well, I would say radio and diving. Diving all over the world and teaching people to dive all over the world was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And I was fortunate to do that for many years and have my own business doing that. But apart from the adventure aspect, as far as work is concerned, otherwise, it was without question radio. The immediacy of radio. I loved what you do, talkback news, talkback format, and the capacity to have people call and immediately comment on something and hear what they have to say, and knowing that they're listening to what you. That grabbed me and still does to this day. The immediacy of live radio is impossible, I think, to beat.
Why aren't you still doing it?
Well, there's only so many gigs. And, I'm not exactly on anyone's speed dial for that, probably. Look, I got out of it initially years ago because of family issues and the need to do more where my children was concerned. And I cover the whole way that came about when I was working in those days at 2UE. And I negotiated an early release from my contract. And I'd always intended that at some stage, I would be making an effort to go back. But one thing has led to another, and family circumstances have made that increasingly difficult.
Yep.
And these days I am a single father, and so there's so much that I can and can't do. I'm now concentrating on writing and how we have my first book.
Yep. It's sad that your marriage broke up. What happened?
Well, look, it's still in a matter before the family law court, and there are a lot of issues, custodial-wise and that concern. But
are you on good terms?
Look, I can't really, I'm sorry, I can't really go into the circumstances of my marriage because of the situation relating to the children.
I understand. I mean, it's a heartbreaking thing. I've been there myself, and I know just what a difficult, terrible time it is.
It's utterly traumatic, and anyone who would be listening to us who has been through separation and divorce, especially where children are concerned, it eats away at your soul. Yeah. And it's a very disturbing thing, and when you have so much concern for what it is, that the impact that it could have on your children, which is the primary thing for me, it's with you every day. And my primary function in all of it is just to make sure my children are as shielded from the difficulties as much as I possibly can.
How old are they?
They're really quite young. One has just turned 7 only a few days ago.
Yeah, that's
the other
difficult.
one is about to turn 9.
That is difficult. It is difficult. Well, it's good that you are mindful of that. How did you meet Pauline Hanson?
I met her in a bar, and once again...
You're kidding!
No, seriously. Yeah, she was dancing on a table. No, I'm kidding. Tassels. I met her in a bar in Canberra. Look, it's an oldie but a goldie. She was there with her secretary having a drink, and she was essentially being assaulted by a young Liberal who was known to me but not someone I was actually with. And I pulled him away and basically shut him down in the nicest possible way one can under the circumstances, and just explained that it was unnecessary. It was inappropriate. I mean, you just don't treat a woman or anyone realistically, but certainly you don't treat a woman like that. Especially in public, in a bar, or under any circumstances.
Yeah.
And so that's how we met. We met under those circumstances.
Well, she is, like you, a very polarizing character.
Yes, that's true. That's true. I mean, a lot of the reason I'm polarising to a degree is the association with her and with One Nation and all that. I think when people get to read the book, they'll find that there's huge levels of things that they would never have expected where I'm concerned. And we both know that these days in particular, everything that you understand about people, or pretty much everything, is gotten from one line on a Twitter feed, or a couple of pieces in Facebook, or a headline. You never get any real background or context or perspective.
No.
None of that ever comes across. And so, where once upon a time we gleaned all of our information from books, it was always read, young man. You would learn from books, and you'd not only learn that something had happened, you'd have an understanding of how and why it happened. And we've lost a lot of that. This book allows me to, I won't say set the record straight, but merely to convey factually, using figures, voting trends, using events of my own life, witness testimony, statements by other people. There are comments in there from Alan Jones, people like John Brennan, the father of Talkback Radio, Tony Abbott. Those are the sorts of people who are quoted, in my book. And, it puts in context, in perspective, in sequence, a whole range of things that people would have never imagined about not just me, but about Tony Abbott, about Pauline Hanson, about the federal parliament, the way our society and politics operates.
Yeah, I'm flying blind because I haven't seen the book, but it's called Before You Judge Me.
Being David, yes.
Being David.
Yeah.
What went wrong in those early days? I mean, I took to Pauline very early on.
Yeah.
Because I saw her as being a very authentic character, very authentic. And for all the wrong reasons, you would imagine that she would have to fail in politics because she wasn't slick, or isn't slick, not particularly good at explaining herself.
No.
But an authentic person who really cares about Australia.
That is certainly the appearance of it, and I explain all this in the book. That what people don't really understand about Pauline, and it's understandable why they don't, is that virtually everything that Pauline ever initiated wasn't actually initiated by Pauline. It was initiated by somebody else behind the scenes. So we've had a scenario where somebody has basically acted in a role. Now, I'm not suggesting that Pauline doesn't believe what she says, but you look at things like Pauline first came to attention through the fact of a letter that she wrote to the Ipswich Times about Aboriginal issues in her electorate, and she was very upset about the sorts of things that appeared to be reverse racism and how Aboriginal people gained things that non-Aboriginal people didn't. But, of course, when you understand the history of that, Pauline didn't write that letter. It was signed by her, but all of the evidence suggests it was actually written by a fellow named Maury Marsden, who was her campaign manager. So that's how she first comes to prominence. She then, of course, is disendorsed by the Liberal Party, wrongly, but she is, and so stands as an independent in an election where there was no Liberal candidate because she was expelled from the party as the candidate when it was too late to have a new candidate and have their name on the ballot paper.
Refresh my memory. Why was she expelled?
Oh, she was in a seat that the Liberals couldn't win, the seat of Oxley. And she was in that seat where she couldn't possibly win. She was just a filler candidate to, of course, attract votes for the Senate. And so the Liberal Party basically wrote her off as no great loss to save face in an election where they didn't want to make look like they had, racists in the party. And it was all based around these comments, coming from this letter that had been written to the Ipswich Times. And so that's how she was out. But they tossed her out at a time when they couldn't replace her because the ballots had already been drawn. And so she was already on the ballot paper as the Liberal. So she went to the election on the paper as Liberal, but was actually an independent, having been disendorsed. So everybody in the electorate, or a lot of the people voting, knew she was no longer a Liberal, liked what she said, and so she got the Liberal vote because there was no Liberal candidate. Plus, she got a lot of the Labor voters who also now knew she was not a Liberal. And so she strangely, for the first time in about 40 years, a person who was not Labor won the seat. So the whole thing was not management, but accident and circumstance. Yeah. You then get to the maiden speech, and, Pauline says all these things. But the speech was written by John Pasquarelli. So you really had Pauline articulating, if you could put it that way, something which was the ideas of somebody else. You then get to the speech that launched One Nation in April 1997, and that was written word for word by me. So you've really had a situation where Pauline has been this character who articulated a whole range of things that, really hit the nerve of so many people across Australia, but none of it actually came from her. It's a little bit like when you go to a movie and you fall in love with the character on film, yes, and almost believe they're a real person, not a person who is scripted and an actor.
Now, did you fall in love with her? I heard you did.
No, not at all. Look, I certainly liked Pauline in the beginning, and I was very much hoping that Pauline would make a difference for Australia and that I could direct her from a vehicular point of view. I could direct her into making that difference by injecting her with what she needed to be able to make that happen. And hence, the first thing that I did was say, you have to form a party. And so I then, co-opted David Ettridge, who lives in South Australia, by the way, and may even be listening. Huh. I co-opted David Ettridge, who I'd known for years, to be the administrator. I became the political person, and Pauline was the figurehead and the leader of the party.
Who came up with the name One Nation?
One Nation, well, I think you're the first person that I've actually told this to in a public sense. We originally wanted the name One Australia, so it was going to be Pauline Hanson's One Australia, but the name One Australia was already held by somebody else and we couldn't wrest it away from them. So the next best thing was One Nation.
Yeah. It's a very, very interesting story, David.
It is, and there's a lot of, I wrote it, so I'm a bit biased perhaps, but I like to think that there's a lot of information in this book, both from an interest, from an adventure point of view, and from a political and social point of view, that people will just not be aware of. Even, as I say, even the history of how Pauline came to be, how the party actually came to be. Yep. It's never actually previously been put
told, the whole story. How old are you, David?
Oh, I'm getting up there. Jeremy. I'm 61.
Are you 61?
I'm 61.
I had no idea. I thought I'd put you down at about, 45?
I wish I had been. I wish I was 45. I had children very late. I've only been married once, and I had children very late.
Yeah.
And but look, I'm in good health.
You sound fine. As Sinatra said, regrets I have a few. What sort of regrets do you have? What's the major regret that you've got?
The regret that I mostly have, which I have put in the book, I regret, no matter how I feel about Pauline these days, I regret not having made her more successful.
And how do you feel about her these days?
Oh, no, look, it's fair to say I'm not a fan because I don't think that the organisation any longer serves the interests of the people they purport to represent. I see it really as being a personal bandwagon. I mean, Pauline has written into her own constitution that she's the president for life. There is no capacity for anybody to really do anything. She tries to be in charge of everything, and in fairness, no one can be in charge of everything. No one can know enough to direct everything and make every decision on their own.
Well, I'll certainly read the book, David. I think it sounds fascinating. Before You Judge Me, Being David.
Terrific stuff. Look, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity of being on with you, Jeremy.